All right. My name is Chris Gettle, and joining me today, as always, is Todd Shell. Todd, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Chris. Doing great. Second month. Here we are on Patch Tuesday. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and January was an incredibly large number of
Crazy.
CVEs resolved.
Yeah.
Yes, very crazy. This month seems almost paltry in comparison, but there's still a few interesting things here and a few things that people will definitely want to be aware of. All right. So jumping into a quick run through, here's our agenda for today. We're going to go through an overview of what released yesterday. Going to talk about some recent cybersecurity news. Todd is then going to walk us through the bulletins and releases that came out. And we also have our Between the Patch Tuesday section, which we'll be talking about a few different things that came out since last Patch Tuesday. So one of the things that, Patch Tuesday is a great point in time to see a huge influx of updates and things that we have to worry about. But there's a lot of vendors that are on more of a continuous release cycle. So, every week we get Google Chrome security updates, which means Edge updates as well. We get things like last month we had Java's quarterly update, which meant that over the course of a couple of more weeks, we've got a whole bunch of Java framework updates for all the variations of Java that people might be using. So activities like that, you want to keep aware of what's going on there. We're going to cover several of those types of updates as well. Quick recap for yesterday, we had Adobe did release several updates along with Microsoft. We're going to cover the updates that Ivanti supports in our catalog directly today from Adobe. There are some additional ones that are not directly part of like the Creative Suite that typically are just updated. There's usually only a few instances in most organizations, but you'll want to be aware of those. The biggest one there this month being the Commerce. Adobe Commerce had 30 out of the 45 CVEs and several of the criticals that they resolved. So that's probably the one of note that also is the first time in several months that we've seen something other than a priority 3 from Adobe. It was listed in their email as a priority 2, but if you look on the actual bulletin page, it was a priority 1. So not sure which we should lean towards, but with the number of vulnerabilities, especially the number of critical vulnerabilities, I would lean towards their priority 1. It is not actively being targeted. No exploits, which is typically when Adobe gives the priority 1 state. But I think there is, from what I've seen in a couple of other articles and things, there was enough of note in there that the Commerce update is probably the biggest thing you want to worry about on the Adobe side this month.
Also of note, based on your comment there, Chris, we still haven't seen a Chrome update. Usually, they're pretty good about releasing every week. Haven't seen one yet. They seem to be focused on Chrome OS at the moment, though. There have been a bunch of releases on OS updates, but nothing on the browser side. So we'll keep looking out for that one.
Yep. So likely later in the week this week. Normally they release late in the evening U.S. time on Patch Tuesday, but we did not see a release there. Thanks for pointing that one out, Todd. So Chrome and Edge, expect that there might be another drop later this week yet for those. So, all right, going through a little bit of news here before we get started. So there's several articles here that we wanted to talk about, a few things beyond the Patch Tuesday releases that you probably want to be aware of. And we'll talk a little bit about Exchange as well. We know that there's still a small but very important group of organizations using Exchange yet. Want to just make sure people are aware of some of the recent announcements and news there and challenges that have been happening on the Exchange side. So we're going to cover a couple of articles there. All right, so just the first one up is our blog post, which recaps a lot of what came out yesterday, gives a little bit of the high-level details of everything going on, along with our update priorities. You're going to hear about the 0 days in a moment here as well. All of that is in the Windows OS this month, so that is your top priority for the known exploited vulnerabilities, and most of the criticals are going to be in the OS. There was a critical vulnerability in Office for Excel. That one, Office, I would say, yes, make sure it gets done in your regular, cycle this month. There's no urgency of confirmed exploits or anything like that to potentially go more aggressively there. but the OS is definitely where the majority of the risk is this month. I did put a note in there. Browsers continue to be one of the steadiest streams of vulnerabilities that we need to address on a continuous basis. So you can take a look at the recommendation there. More and more organizations are starting to break into multiple remediation tracks, and this is kind of coinciding with that guidance. Have your monthly maintenance for end user devices, especially have a more frequent weekly priority update window where you're taking care of not only the vulnerabilities that pass through your production cycle this month. Normally you would then add those to your priority updates going forward. That way anybody who was offline or missed an update or so on gets caught, and make sure we get those updated in between, but also making sure that we stay on top of those continuous release products like the browsers especially. Between the three major browsers, you get 2 to 3 releases from Firefox, and then a weekly release from Chrome, which has security updates in it, which means that the Chromium-based browsers like Edge, Opera, and others will continuously need to be updated as well. So it's recommended to put the browsers into more of that continuous cadence of at least weekly to try to reduce the number of those vulnerabilities. So there's a few notes in there like that. A good read there if you want to take a look. And this, by the way, comes out Tuesday afternoons, typically, around 3 to 4 Central Time is when we try to target having that blog post up. It varies depending on what all happens day to day. Larger months, it could take a little bit longer, but that's a quick read that you can get that gives you some of the information that we cover today, but a little bit in advance. There's a couple of other kind of major security issues that you want to be aware of. Apple did just have a release recently for the iPhone and iPads that was an urgent update for plugging a USB vulnerability. It's the type of vulnerability that is more of a commercial spyware type target. So vulnerabilities like Pegasus that we dealt with before. This is that type of vulnerability where somebody could get access to a device and bypass security features on that through this vulnerability to be able to go into restricted mode on a locked device. So the type of thing where a stolen device or a lost device becomes a major security concern when somebody has the ability to bypass those features and get access to that information. So this is one where it's definitely a high concern, but a fairly minimal, targeted kind of attack that would be exposed to this, especially high-profile users and devices that have proprietary information or PII on them would be devices that you'd be especially concerned about this. So most of our, executives and things are using iPhones, iPads, other technologies like that. They would be the type of users that we would be concerned about those devices being unlocked by somebody who may have stolen that device and could get access to proprietary information or customer information. So that's an update that just came out recently here. Article just aired yesterday, but I believe the iPhone and iPad updates came out a little bit before that. So just a note there to be aware of. One thing, especially with the DeepSeek news that's happened recently, a lot of organizations may still be in the process of getting their AI adoption strategy in place. One of the most important things to keep up with is more of the CISO or security side of that AI adoption, and DeepSeek is a good example of why that's important. So prior to the recent news about DeepSeek, just like our own security council and our CISO had already been assessing technologies like that and warning people, hey, okay, this is a new, exciting, but also unverified, technology out there in the AI world. It also had some potential geopolitical ties that were, unknown at that point. So we had already been steering our teams internally away from DeepSeek. With the news that came out recently, we did a more, kind of forceful update internally saying this technology is banned. even in offline mode, making sure that people understand the policy and things like that internally. So especially our engineering teams saw notifications about that leading up to, and additional notifications after the news broke that there were some serious security concerns with that. This type of visibility, it needs to be part of your AI strategy. So I'm just including this link here. I thought it was a good read. Not something I was actively looking for this month, but I think it shows kind of what you need to be looking at internally from a security perspective when you're looking at emerging technologies like the AI technologies, Gen AI, that we've been all rapidly ramping up on over the last year, 18 months here. So a good read, just to understand more about what CISOs are doing and some of the guidance and framework that they're putting in place around this. But one of the important things there is to establish a good visibility within your organization, ways to communicate what should be used, what shouldn't be used, how it should be used, and levels of control that you can put in place to ensure that your organization is not being exposed to security concerns around AI. North Korea has some new activities going on here, some new PowerShell tricks that they're using to hijack devices. So this article goes into a little bit of detail about that. It's definitely a major social engineering strategy, giving, basically masquerading as a South Korean official and convincing a user to take several steps to basically set up your system to be able to message and share information with this government official. In the process, they basically load on using PowerShell malicious code and put on things like remote desktop tools and other capabilities to get access to the devices of the people they're targeting. So it's one of those that nation state threat actors are definitely taking advantage of. Not all of us are affected by nation state level, but it's expected that there's going to be more threat actors beyond the nation state level could start to take advantage of that. That also talks about there was a scheme going on where a U.S. citizen was basically setting up a laptop farm and allowing the North Korean threat actor to basically set up employees masquerading as U.S. citizens to be able to get into organizations. And they had upwards of 70, I think, different identities of U.S. persons that were compromised. And they were trying to get into organizations and get access to information within there. So another just thing to be aware of is the social engineering aspects of cyber threats right now are definitely getting more and more sophisticated in their methods. They're going to extreme lengths to masquerade as U.S. identities and be able to embed people within organizations. So even your recruiters and the way that you're recruiting and employing and employees is something that we need to think about from a cybersecurity perspective nowadays. So another good read there. Some trends that are continuing both from a social engineering their way onto devices to social engineering people into our organizations. We're going to talk about Linux here in a little bit. There's a couple of slides on Linux that we're going to cover as well, but we talked a little bit about the Linux kernel and the number of vulnerabilities that are being resolved on there, looking like they're skyrocketing. Really, it's just giving visibility into the vulnerabilities that are being resolved. They were fixing a lot of things in the kernel before. Now we're just getting visibility into that now that the Linux kernel has become its own CNA. One of note, though, there is a known exploited vulnerability that was recently added to the CISA KEV list. That's 2024-53104. The vulnerability, only has a CVSS score of 7.8. But again, we've talked about this many times. In fact, all three of the known exploited vulnerabilities we're going to talk about today are all rated important and have a 7.8 or less CVSS score. But this gives some guidance around this kernel vulnerability. The recommendation right now is to apply the latest kernel updates. Since January 1 this year, I saw another article that said that there have already been 233 CVEs resolved in the Linux kernel this year alone, and we're only in mid-February. So there's definitely a lot that they're working on in there, and some of them, this one in particular, is actively being exploited. So this one has been given a 3-week recommendation from CISA for agencies that are required to remediate within their timeframes. So the 3-week timer for resolving this Linux kernel vulnerability has already started. The vulnerability in particular affects Linux kernels from version 2.6.26 up to the latest versions in late 2024. So basically, all of the kernel versions that people are likely running right now are exposed to this vulnerability that's actively being targeted. So Linux kernels, make sure to get a 2025 Linux kernel update in place to plug this one in particular. Moving over to the Exchange topic, there were a couple of things that we wanted to point out here. The first one is there have been some issues with outdated Exchange servers not being able to receive new emergency mitigation definitions because an Office configuration service certificate type is being deprecated. So this article talks about if you are on an older version of Exchange, not up at the latest, and you are trying to use those emergency mitigation definitions, this could be affecting you. So you may want to take a look, see what versions of the September 2020, 2021 or later cumulative updates. Let's see here. EEMS runs on Windows Service on Exchange mailbox servers and automatically installed on servers with mailbox role after deploying the September 2021 or later cumulative update. According to the Exchange team, it's not able to contact the OCS and download new interim security mitigations on out-of-date servers running Exchange versions older than March 2023. So if you are using EEMS and your Exchange server is running an update older than March 2023, you're most likely not getting any mitigations anymore. You're getting an error message. One of the older certificates is the cause for that. So that's one of the issues going on there. The bigger one is the upcoming end of support for Exchange Server 2016 and Exchange Server 2019. So this is something where October last year, they announced this, and October this year, same, where October is going to be a big month for end of lives, but Exchange 2016 and 2019 will be out of support. It will still run, but you're not going to get any security updates after that. The guidance here is to migrate to either Exchange Online or upgrade to the Exchange Server Subscription Edition, the SE Edition, when it becomes available in early H2 of 2025. So just a heads up, make sure that this is on your radar and that you're looking into what your plans are for maintaining Exchange past October. So that is it for the Exchange updates. If you're following along in the presentation, we're now going to go into the next couple of slides here of specific CVEs of note that we wanted to talk about. The first of which are the two new confirmed exploited vulnerabilities. The first of those is the elevation of privilege vulnerability in Windows storage. Rated important, CVSS score was 7.1. The attack vector in this case is referred to as local, and that means that the attacker has to execute something locally, but it doesn't mean they have to do the executing. So they could be, figuring out some way to execute that remotely, but it has to execute locally on that system. It's not a remotely exploitable vulnerability. In this case, the exploit is functional. They do have confirmed samples of exploit code available that they've been able to evaluate. So they definitely know it's actively being exploited, and they've seen code that can actually take advantage of this. This one in particular gives the attacker the ability to delete targeted files on a system. Now, elevation of privilege allows you to delete some targeted files. How bad does that sound? The next part here is where it gets a little bit more interesting. The vulnerability does not allow disclosure of any confidential information, but could allow an attacker to delete data that could include data that results in a service being unavailable. Whatever the attacker did in this case, this vulnerability allowed them to delete some files that were critical to some service on that system and allowed them to carry on the next part of their attack. So making a service unavailable or unstable or unresponsive is definitely something a lot of threat actors will try to do to, head off any protections or other things on the device so that they can further compromise it. So this is most likely a vulnerability that would be used in a chain, multiple vulnerabilities together to give them what they need on that device. So actively being exploited, this one in particular, if we go down to the impacted platforms, you can see that we've got everything from Windows 10 and Server 2016 up to the latest Server 2025 and Windows 11 editions. So all your current Windows editions that are under support are affected by this 0-day. The second one is the elevation of privilege in Windows Ancillary Function Driver for WinSock. Very long name. Important severity, 7.8 CVSS score, actively being exploited. And yes, again, the exploit code maturity is listed as functional, meaning there are Microsoft has seen and confirmed code samples being able to exploit this. This one is a little bit more dangerous than the last one. It allows the attacker to gain system level privileges. So at that point, they own that box. They can do most everything they want to once they exploit this vulnerability permissions wise. This one dates all the way back to Server 2008. So 2008, 2012, Windows 10, Server 2016, all the way up to the latest editions. This one affects all Windows OS editions that are currently supported or in ESU support. So between these two, that pretty much made the OS update your critical update to get in place as soon as possible across your organization this month. Now, there was a third 0-day, but this one is revised. It's our friend Secure Boot that we've talked about a couple of times over the past year plus here. But the first time we saw this was back in mid 2023 when it first came out, and we've seen several updates to it over time. Now, yes, actively being exploited. One that we've had, some challenges with, definitely with the Secure Boot variations that can be used as well. But a number of organizations have, spent some time making sure that they work through and try to get this resolved in there. You need to go in and figure out how to manage your Windows Boot Manager revocations. You need to do some additional work around that. Most of you have already done those things, if not all of you. What's new in this month's release? There's two parts here to the revision this month. The first one, pretty straightforward. Microsoft was just making sure that people are aware that, yes, the latest Windows 11 24H2 and Windows Server 2025 are affected by this. So updates to make sure that those are able to be resolved as well. The second part is where the language is leaning towards basically saying we revised the updates for Windows 11 22H2 and 23H2 because it didn't fully fix the issue. So this one is saying to comprehensively address this vulnerability, Microsoft has released security updates for all affected versions of Windows 11 22H2 and 23H2. So did the previous one not quite do it? Long story short, to be entirely sure that this is resolved, you want to get those, all your Windows 11 editions will, have this in the Windows OS update this month. Now, because of the other two, you're going to be doing this update anyway, so probably doesn't matter. But there was just some ambiguity in the language used there that made it sound like, yeah, they had to do some additional work on the other Windows 11 editions to make sure that it was fully fixed. So their guidance is make sure to get the February update updated across all Windows 11 and Server 2025 editions to make sure you've fully protected from this vulnerability. So that is the 3 zero-day vulnerabilities for this month. 2 new, 1 updated. There are 2 publicly disclosed vulnerabilities that also came up this month. The first one is for those of you who are running Surface Pros. If you are, this next one is a security feature bypass that affects the Surface Pros. The attacker needs to be adjacent in this case. So basically, they need to be somewhere where they can get access to that device from an adjacent network stack. There is some specifics around the complexity and details of this vulnerability in the FAQ. Successful exploitation requires multiple conditions to be met. There's many steps the attacker has to take to be able to target this one. The successful exploitation requires a user to first reboot their machine before they can actually take advantage of it as well. But there's several steps to be able to do this one. It does affect, looks like, I don't know exactly if this covers all Surface editions, but you've got everything from the Surface Hub, the Pro editions, the ARM variation of the Surface Pros, which means the newer Surface Pros, and then the Surface Windows Dev Kit. So many different components here. Safe to say if you've got any type of Surface devices or do any development around Surface devices, this vulnerability could be affecting anything you're doing on the Surface side. It's only publicly disclosed, not actively being exploited. The exploit code maturity is unproven, meaning whatever researchers submitted this didn't have like samples that they gave directly to Microsoft that could be confirmed or anything like that. But it's been publicly disclosed that something like this is possible. So, there's some information out there. Bar for this one seems pretty high. The other one is where there's a little bit more of a concern. This one is around NTLM hash disclosure. It's a spoofing vulnerability. Important severity, CVSS score of a 6.5, exploitable over the network. Exploit code maturity is functional. So it's been publicly disclosed. There is functional code samples potentially publicly available. Hard to say, within here, but it's definitely something that's a little bit more tangible. The attacker could disclose a user's NTLM v2 hash, which they could then use to authenticate as that user. So I can get control of somebody's identity with this. So if you're using NTLM still within your organization, this could be a vulnerability that might be concerning there. Again, the good news is the fix is in the Windows OS update, which we're already talking about getting updated across everything. So good news is you've got bigger reasons to get this patch in place. This one will just be taken care of with that as well. All right. We'll go through a couple more things here just to wrap up the news section, and then we'll jump back over into the presentation. Ivanti's security update for February is also available. If you are not already subscribed, you can go out to Avanti.com and under the resources, go to the blog, or just go to blog.avanti.com. Out here, you're going to see a section on the right, the topics section, Security Advisory. Under there, you have the ability to subscribe to this feed via RSS. For those of you running Ivanti products, I highly recommend doing this. That way you can stay in touch with the latest that comes out. You can see that normally we do just a monthly update. We occasionally do security updates out of band when needed, but most of the updates will be around kind of that monthly cadence, giving our customers some predictability around when to expect things as well. This month, we do have 3 product areas that received updates. The Ivanti Cloud Service Application, so the CSA, did get an update this month. There were a couple of vulnerabilities. Actually, I think one might have been one vulnerability resolved in there. Nothing actively being exploited right now. Just a couple of vulnerabilities that were disclosed to us from external researchers that we wanted to get resolved. If you are running anything 5.0.4 or earlier, you should update to the CSA 5.0.5. If you are on the 4X CSA, we highly recommend upgrading to the application-based version It's the 4x CSA is no longer supported, so we're not doing security updates for that anymore. We've announced that last year already. So it's highly recommended to get up to the 5x version, and then updating to 5.0.5 resolves the latest 2 vulnerabilities. MDM, on the MDM side, Ivanti Neurons for MDM had 1 vulnerability, I think. Yes, a medium that was resolved there. The cloud service automatically updated as of January 17th, 2025. So that is something that there's a note here to the HackerOne researcher that found it, but we've resolved that and just had this as the disclosure date for when we were notifying around that one. So that is resolved. The last one is the Connect Secure Policy Secure and Secure Access Client. So for those of you using our network security products, there are several vulnerabilities resolved there. One thing to note in the FAQ is, again, just a statement around supportability. If you are on the 9X versions, those are no longer supported. Engineering stopped for those products back in June last year. We, again, highly recommend that you upgrade to the 22X versions of those products to make sure that you're keeping up with security updates. So if you are on a 9X version, no security update available. Again, this is just a reminder, make sure that you're working towards getting upgraded to the 20X or 22X version. But those are the downloads for each of those are available on our downloads portal and available to resolve these new vulnerabilities. So 3 criticals, 4 mediums, and 1 high. Again, we are not aware of any exploitation of any of the vulnerabilities resolved this month. So do a couple of quick updates around the Linux side, and then we'll jump into this month's security updates. There are a number of rsync servers exposed to a number of code execution attacks. So 2 of the vulnerabilities we're showcasing this month for Linux. For those of you who join us monthly, we talked a little bit about our partner TuxCare. They give us a few of the vulnerabilities that you should really be aware of and looking out for. The top 2 on this list are 2 of the ones that they had in there. The third one was just the, hey, general announcement, get your kernel updates in place, because there's a lot of them and there will continue to be for some time here as they resolve a number of those, which we've already talked about. So heap buffer overflow, information leak via uninitialized stack. Both of these are in the next couple of slides in the presentation if you look ahead. But this is just an article talking about those 2 vulnerabilities being some of the ones exposed on rsync servers. It's there are other areas that are exposed to that as well. There were a couple of news articles here as well about the Linux 0-day. So the CISA KEV list talked about that Linux kernel vulnerability. You can easily find some news articles about that, but there's a confirmed attacks against that vulnerability. This one's just reiterating your kernel updates this month. Definitely get them in place, because there's one actively being targeted right now that you'll want to get resolved as quickly as possible. Oh, here it is. I was looking for this before. It was in this article. Federal agencies were given 3 weeks to patch the Linux kernel. That was as of earlier this week, I think. Oh, no, last week. So you're already pretty much done with week 1 of that. You got 2 weeks left to get those in place if you are under CISA's umbrella for responding to that. But that next couple of articles just talked about the Linux kernel flaw and making sure that you stay on top of getting those vulnerabilities resolved. We talked through the different news links in here. You've got access to download that presentation, so you've got access to all those links. We talked through the 2 new 0-day vulnerabilities on the Microsoft side, the Secure Boot revision, which again was affecting the later OSs, and then our public disclosures for the Surface devices and for NTLM. We talked about our Ivanti's security updates this month. And we talked about our Linux security updates, so that 12.084 and 12.085, and then the kernel volume of CVEs for the kernel so far this year, and the fact that there's a 0-day in that mix as well. The kernel is definitely a top priority on the Linux side this month. All right. Todd, there was a question before about servicing stack updates. Did we have any details on that we need to bring up right now? Or
sure, we can talk through it real quick. And actually, Long responded to some of it in the chat session, in the Q&A session. So last month, if you looked at this chart that I have here on the right-hand side, all of those would have been identified as January updates for the SSUs. And Microsoft is a little cagey about telling us which SSUs are technically required for a future update and which ones are optional. So what ended up happening last month is a couple of the Server 2012 and the I believe the bottom Windows 10 one for Server 2016 ended up being almost mandatory, or they were mandatory. So what ended up happening then was you had to install those prior to installing the January normal cumulative updates. So that's a little different than it has been. This month, we see that there are 3 updates issued for Server 2012 and just the base version of Windows 10, the LTSC version, essentially. So I don't know offhand if those are technically mandatory, but it depends upon also what version of the SSU you had previously running to do the updates. So it is a little vague the way Microsoft approaches this, and I think maybe that was the question that Keith had in the Q&A. But these are still separate updates. In the the most recent versions of Windows 10 and then Windows 11, they finally rolled the SSU into the overall update, so we don't have to deal with this anymore. But for these ESU and a couple of the Windows 10 systems, you still have to apply them separately. And sometimes you have to apply them prior to a cumulative update.
Got it. Thanks, Todd.
Yep.
All right. Windows 10 and Windows 11 lifecycle. Just we've been getting a lot of questions about this, and actually we'll talk about it on the next slide here. But end of support dates for Windows 10. Obviously, we're coming up. It feels like half a year away yet, but it's going to creep up on us really quickly. So October is the end of life date for regular support for Windows 10, and then we'll be entering into year 1 of ESU support. Windows 11 also is going to have 22H2, the first Windows 11 branch will end of support in October as well. So be aware of those as they're creeping up on us very quickly. On that note, we're getting a lot of questions about this already. Todd and I have been working on getting things in place to be able to prepare for and inform people of how support will work for Windows 10 ESUs. If you are using one of the Ivanti products to do your Windows patching, we have some of you are using our third-party product to tackle the third-party updates in the Microsoft stack. In the case where you're using our products directly, that's where we're handling the Windows updates for you. Yes, we are planning to support the Windows 10 ESU. A couple of things about that. Microsoft is doing some pretty specific changes compared to what they did with Server 2012. They had this kind of monthly subscription kind of thing that was going on there. They decided to scrap that again and go back to you buy 1 year worth of support. It's a fixed price for that year, and each year it doubles basically. So first year, and these prices are what Todd and I were able to find. So depending on what you see, you may see different than this, but Todd, I believe it was 61 for the first year, 122 Correct. For year 2, right?
Yep, you got it.
Yep. So the price doubles each year on the Microsoft side, and that's per Windows 10 device that you need to manage. Then you basically manage a manual key download and then apply that key to your Windows 10 systems that you're licensing to support that. And with that, you've basically enabled your system to receive ESU patches. Now, depending on how you want to deliver those, if you're delivering them through Microsoft or through Ivanti products, that's where this next part comes into play. If you're using Ivanti Neurons for patch management, Patch for Endpoint Manager, that's Ivanti's Endpoint Manager, and then Ivanti Security Controls. Those are the 3 products that we're going to be continuing to support Windows 10 ESU with. There is an additional feed that you need to subscribe to on our side. Apologies, everyone. I know you're already paying Microsoft for it. It's an operational cost for us. So these editions stop being supported. New ones keep coming out. So basically, it's just making it so we have to extend our support operationally for 3 years. That's what the subscription fee is for us. Todd and I have worked very hard to try to make sure we've applied a scale to that to make it so that we're giving you an equitable, way of getting into that. So if I'm licensed for 100 machines versus 10,000 machines, that subscription fee will be applied at a reasonable coverage for that. That way we can make sure to support this for all of our customers and that need it and keep operating. So that's the subscription fee from the Ivanti side. It's a single price point for, it doesn't matter how many systems you're supporting, you'll pay that one fee and you've got access to that Windows 10 ESU content for everything in that feed. You do need to have the Microsoft subscription for ESUs. Otherwise, even with our feed, your patches won't apply. They'll look there and see that you don't have a key in place and it will fail. So it is an additional cost there. But again, if you have questions about that, let us know. We can explain more details about that. It's the content services. It's the infrastructure to test. It's basically just continuing to support that in our catalog. If you do need information about getting access to that feed and you're starting to plan for and prep for that, we're hoping to have all information in place here with knowledge base articles, the legal addendum to add this support feed on, and the SKUs in place for you to be able to purchase this, targeting, hopefully end of February or early March, so that you can get ahead of this and make sure that everything is in place. We know that there's several people already asking for this. So just to make you aware, Microsoft is going to be launching Windows 10. It's the last Windows 10 edition is the one that's continuing forward. They'll only be doing it for 22H2, not for the previous version. So you still need to get all Windows 10 editions up to 22H2. And then if you subscribe to the ESU support, you'll be able to continue getting monthly updates for those additional 3 years, depending on which you subscribe to. I think that covers everything on that topic. Again, if you have any more questions beyond what's on this slide already, we'll have a knowledge base article coming shortly here that'll be on Ivanti's community that will answer many of the questions about that. But if you've been on one of our previous ESUs, it will be very similar to what you've already done. So expect that you'll just be continuing on with Windows 10 in a very similar way. Now, we do expect a lot more people to be on the Windows 10 ESU than the server ones previously. So for those of you who have not done an ESU before, I do recommend starting to dig in and talk to your Microsoft rep, get things in place there, and talk to your Ivanti rep. And as we get the information available to them here, again, we'll be briefing all of our teams in the field shortly on how this all works. But start planning for it now to make sure that you're in place and ready to go so you don't have any gaps in your security coverage for Windows 10 systems. All right, Todd, I've taken up most of the time today. There was more to cover than expected. Bulletins and releases.
A lot of stuff in the news. Yeah, let's talk about what we released yesterday. As Chris mentioned, there were a number of releases from Adobe. I've included the Creative Cloud ones here just to talk about some of the vulnerabilities. They did release an update for InCopy. It addresses both InCopy 19 and InCopy 20. There was one vulnerability fix. They rated it as critical. There was an update for Adobe InDesign, addresses 7 vulnerabilities. And as Chris mentioned earlier, none of these are known exploited or publicly disclosed as far as information about these vulnerabilities. There were 4 critical vulnerabilities and 3 important ones as part of this 7 update package. And finally, there was an update for Adobe Illustrator as well, 3 vulnerabilities in this case, all of which were rated critical. So, as you're doing your Creative Cloud updates, make sure you include these particular applications. On the Windows 11 side, not nearly the number of vulnerabilities addressed as last month, as we talked about earlier. There were 37 vulnerabilities. Chris talked about the important ones that are known exploited. The first three there I highlighted in red, and then of course the other two publicly disclosed. Again, the 2023 vulnerability was a re-release around the secure boot that we talked about. There are some known issues around Windows 11. These have been carried forward a couple of months now. There's an issue regarding OpenSSH that has been out since October of 2024. And there's also an issue around the Citrix session recording agent running into problems with the updates. So be aware of these. They're still working. They still claim they're working on workarounds for these, but be aware that I haven't seen anything now for quite a few months. And finally, there was an issue around this Roblox program that's been around for quite a while on Windows 11 24H2. Not really necessarily a big problem, but just be aware of it. On the Windows 10 side, for the first time in a long time, we actually saw fewer updates on Windows 10 than we see on Windows 11. Only 33 vulnerabilities addressed in Windows 10 compared to the 37 that I just showed you in Windows 11. Same CVEs basically as far as publicly disclosed and known exploited. As Chris showed you in the listing, covers all of these different operating system versions. Same problems that I talked about before. One thing with note on this first one, this 505-2000 KB article, when I took a look at it, there's actually a third known issue reported, and it has to do with a digital audio controller on USB 1.0. It's listed as a known issue, but then when you look at the workaround that they put for this, it actually says, see this article. So I dug through this article in a little more depth, and strangely enough, there's a note on the fixed items on the front page of this KB that says fixed. We have fixed this problem in this particular KB. So they reported as both an issue and fixed. I suspect what happened was they got kind of down to the end of the release cycle, and they were able to get a fix in at the last moment, and they decided to address it this way. So it's kind of strange, but it appears that it is fixed and it's not an issue. There was a new vulnerability or new known issue reported in the 2021 and the 2022 H2 releases here. It's called Broker. This is new this month. We haven't seen this one before. It looks like it was introduced in the January release. What's interesting is that you'll see an error related to this particular sgrm broker.exe service running. And it turns out that they terminated some functionality in Windows Defender, apparently, and they're still getting some error messages logging. They said, ignore this, don't worry about it. It's not really a problem. It doesn't have any performance issues per se, other than the logging of the event itself. And they said they'll get around to cleaning this up in a future version. So just be aware of this one. It's almost like a reported issue that's a non-issue, but you might see it in your Windows Event Viewer when you're taking a look through the log. So just kind of be aware of that one. Thought that was interesting. It also showed up under Windows Server 2022. We did see the updates for the Office applications. They did address 8 different vulnerabilities here, all rated. A bunch of them were rated critical, so be aware of that one. Make sure that, like as Chris said, the main focus this month is on the operating system side, because some of those are known exploited. On the Office side, they're not. So they are rated critical, but no known exploitation or public disclosure. The same is true for the online applications of Office. Again, this covers the 365 apps, Office 2019, the long-term service channel versions of 2021 and 2024 as well. These are slightly different vulnerabilities. There's a couple differences between the online and the on-premise versions, but overall 8 addressed in both of these updates. We did see an update on SharePoint Server as well this month, rated important, just a single vulnerability, which is not known to be exploited or publicly disclosed. Between the Patch Tuesdays, we saw a lot of activity this month. We had, as Chris mentioned, the Java update and other Oracle updates that came out between the Patch Tuesdays. We break them out into security updates with CVEs, without CVEs, and non-security updates, and this is a list of all. And the number in parentheses are the number of updates that came out this month for the various applications. Going through these pretty quickly here. Third parties with CVE information, there were updates for Adobe Premiere, update for Snagit, just 4 vulnerabilities there. We do see the weekly Chrome updates. Still waiting on our one for this week, as I mentioned at the intro to this call. But we did have 3 between last Patch Tuesday and this Patch Tuesday. Still addressing small number of security vulnerabilities, only 3 there in the last one. We did see an update for Node.js this month. Number of vulnerabilities addressed there. In each one of the different layers, they have the current, the LTS upper, and LTS lower this particular month. We did see updates for Foxit PDF editor, 4 vulnerabilities addressed in each one of those versions. We did see some VirtualBox updates as well, 2 vulnerabilities in each of those. Of course, we saw our usual Firefox and Thunderbird, our updates from Mozilla on the Mozilla side of the house for both their extended service versions as well as their mainstream version. So you see the Firefox 135 there. Getting into the Java development updates that Chris talked about, they're still supporting, we talk about the long-term service channel versions of Java here. They are the Java 8, Java 11, 17, and 21. They have changed their model through the years. Some of these are JREs. Some of these are just part of the development kit anymore, where you have to do your Java updates and compile them into the code. But anyway, as far as the vulnerabilities go, there were 2 in Java 8 this quarter rather, and 1 in each of the other versions of Java. So you'll see this is the Oracle release here, directly from Oracle. But you'll also see that now, Azul Zulu has rolled this into their updates, same vulnerabilities addressed with their releases for 11, 17, and 21. Same thing for Amazon. Their Java updater is called Corretto. They incorporated this CVE into their updates as well. Moving on to the Apple side, we did see an OS update this month from Apple. And there, as a matter of fact, there was an update just recently where there were no CVEs reported yet. I haven't seen them. But earlier this month, there was a set of CVEs. I'll show you those here in a second. And they had a number of non-security updates as well. So these are the updates on the Apple OS side. Of course, the current 3 supported versions, Ventura 13.7.3, 30 vulnerabilities there. The Sonoma equivalent version, 40 vulnerabilities. And finally, their latest and greatest, Sequoia 15.3, which just came out last fall, addressed 59 vulnerabilities. Safari is also updated separately for Ventura and Sonoma. It's part of Sequoia these days directly, but if you are running either one of those operating systems, you should support and update Safari 8.18.3 separately. Of course, the common applications running across the Mac side, we have Chrome and their regular updates. We see again the same Firefox updates and very similar number of vulnerabilities addressed. There are some specific to Mac that are different from Windows. But for the most part, as I'm looking through the list of these, they're very similar, and there's a lot of overlap, generally about 90% overlap, as a matter of fact. And of course, Mac OS also can run Microsoft Edge. So there are separate updates for Edge running on Mac OS. Again, one major update here that came out earlier in January of the 1.15 addressed 15 vulnerabilities, and a recent one there with just 1 vulnerability. So, there is a lot of activity in between the Patch Tuesdays, even though we don't, talk about it all that often. You need to keep up with all of your applications there. With that, Chris, I kind of flew through that pretty quickly. Let's get back to the questions here.
Thanks, Todd. Going through there's definitely a lot of complicated questions this month. So I think we're covered on the ESU stuff. The questions that I saw there, we just tackled. Again, if you've got more questions there, best to reach out and we'll give you more details. And again, we'll have more information. By March Patch Tuesday, we'll probably be able to share some knowledge base articles and stuff with you on some more details there. There was one good question about the Linux side. How do you know what applies to the flavors you're using in the Linux world? In this person's case, they were saying, how do I know if this applies to AWS? I can pass this information on, but is it relevant to the flavors that we're using? Is kind of the general question. The Linux world has a very unfortunate level of ambiguity because it's open source. Unless you're on one of the enterprise Linux flavors like Red Hat, Oracle, AWS, the ambiguity gets even greater. I would say if you are on a specific flavor and it's one of the enterprise flavors, see what feeds they have available and definitely subscribe to those because you're going to get some of the best information. AWS actually has an interesting approach that they've introduced, which is Todd, I think they refer to it as snapshotting, right?
Right.
Yeah. So basically, they're trying to take a more kind of solid tested approach and say, hey, you should be testing up to this latest snapshot. That's something that they've tested in on their side and said this level of RPMs works well together. So you can patch by security advisories, or you can use this kind of checkpoint model there for that. So that's definitely one thing to take a look at is, are they notifying you what's in these snapshots and kind of giving you better visibility into that? Red Hat and Oracle in general give a little bit more security detail. When you start to get into many of the other flavors, the amount of security information starts to become sparse. We've talked about a few vulnerabilities in previous months where the CVE was announced 6 months to a year ago, but there's still things happening, still updates occurring and stuff like that. It just takes that long because once the vulnerability is identified, all of those different open source projects have to go and resolve it in their own way. So it does make it so it's difficult to figure out these things sometimes. I would say for Linux kernel and for things like OpenSSL, when you see news about those, it's almost always affecting all flavors. So in those cases, it's kind of more of a blanket, hey, this is something I should be concerned about. The 233 CVEs that have already been resolved in Linux kernel, including that 0-day, those are ones that I expect every flavor of Linux is going to need to do those same things because the kernel is updated and all Linux flavors are pulling that in. So that one, to answer that specific question, this one definitely should affect AWS as well. There was another question about NTLM authentication and how to approach that with the business and policymakers internally. This goes beyond just NTLM. It could be Exchange, it could be NTLM, it could be any of the other, security protocols and other things that we've seen end of life or deprecate over the last couple of years. The biggest thing to do to try to get visibility around this and move things forward is make sure you're phrasing your conversation in terms that your C-suite, your board, that they're going to understand. Don't just say, hey, there's a security flaw here that needs to be fixed. You need to change the tone of that over to talking about business risk. It's hard to, it seems like it should just make sense, but literally if you're in a room with those people and you're pitching here's the vulnerabilities we need to resolve and here's why, that's going to completely gloss them over. They're going to tune that out very quickly. Phrase it in terms of business risk. Figure out what systems, in the case of NTLM, what systems in your environment are using NTLM and could be impacted by this. 1 or 2 business critical systems, you can quantify that now. Hey, NTLM is required for this system that we're using today. If we don't get ahead of this, this system becomes a security concern. Microsoft at some point is going to stop investing in NTLM authentication and will be exposed if this continues to use that type of authentication. So you might have to do a little bit more legwork before you can pitch this, but if you understand what the business impact of that is, you can then start to present we need to look at these areas. Here's the business impact with ideally a dollar amount behind it. This is responsible for X amount of millions of dollars for the company, whatever the case may be. If we don't figure out how to get off of this, that is real world business risk for them. That will make them tune in. So that's probably the best way that I can suggest to do that. It definitely, for those who have had to make that shift over to talking in those terms, it's one of those where it's like, I really don't understand what you're saying until suddenly it clicks and you see it in action and see them respond differently when you put it in those terms. That's the best way I can guide you to say this is how you get them mobilized around that. I think that was a lot of the big ones there. Todd, any other specific ones that came up that we think we need to address here? I know we're a few minutes over already.
Yeah, there was a question about Creative Cloud, Chris, on our support. So in our product set today, we support Creative Cloud on the Windows side. We're working on the Mac side. That's underway. We've added in the applications over the last 2 months essentially. And the updates for the ones I mentioned today are on the way to come out today, as well as the ESU updates will be released today, and the Office 365 online versions will be released today. Typically, the O365 patches release very late in the day on Patch Tuesday, so we generally get them out the next morning. So whoever was asking there, very quickly, they will be on the way shortly.
I think that's everything we can address well here. I know there's a couple of other questions that there's a lot of ambiguity around there, like, hey, is there a chance that Exchange to Exchange 2019 to Exchange SE might be pushed out? I mean, we could speculate. Microsoft has been talking about this move for a while. I would not count on it to get pushed out again. Maybe you'll get lucky and it will, but chances are it's really kind of gaining weight here, and you're going to be stuck without security support. Now, there could be cases where, Server 2008, even after the 3 years of ESU, there was still enough of a very important group, and I speculate it's probably critical infrastructure that forced it. But there was a need to move beyond that and still support it for a limited time for a very limited subset. Beyond that, I don't know if you can count on that for Exchange. So I would say be prepared for that move, like it's going to happen for sure this time. That's the best advice I could offer there. But yeah, there's a couple of other questions that are kind of, we can only speculate. So I think we'll wrap there for this month. A lot of really good questions. As always, we'll try to bring you as much information as we can in the time that we've got. Additional resources that you may still want to check out. Patchmanagement.org, always a good one that I suggest people subscribe to. There's a lot of very smart people, very in tune with a lot of the topics we're talking about here in that community, and you can definitely catch a lot of those topics going on there as well. So that's always a good one. But yeah, we'll continue to try to bring you as much information as possible month after month. And thank you, as always, for tuning in for another year of Patch Tuesday with us.
Thanks, everyone.